thought leadership from PwC.
Kind of the entire economy is built on the ecosystems sort of working the way they have for the last 2,000 years when we built civilization. And if one of them stops functioning the way we're used to, the entire economy is going to have to adapt.
Today, we're kicking off a brand new series focused on biodiversity in business, becoming nature positive. This is PwC's Accounting Podcast. I'm Heather Horn, and thanks so much for joining us today. If you thought that the E in ESG was really just a synonym for climate, you'd be far from alone. With so much focus on the SEC's climate disclosure proposal in the U.S., climate's taken the focus of many preparers and investors. And, of course, for good reason. However, another issue is quickly gaining attention as governments and companies begin to understand the size of the problem and its potential impacts, including both positive and negative, on business, natural resources, and biodiversity. Well, this may be a new topic for some of you. As you'll get into the series, you'll quickly gain a sense for the interdependencies that business has with natural resources and why, similar to climate change, this is becoming a much bigger focus area for companies that are wanting to manage their risks and opportunities holistically. To kick things off, we invited one of our experienced podcast pros, PwC National Office partner, and global ESG technical topic team leader, Andreas Ohl. Andreas will help set the stage and give a few examples to illuminate the types of issues that biodiversity encompasses, as well as provide a preview of the rest of the series. Andreas is good at connecting the dots on this issue for a lot of our listeners who may be newer to sustainability issues other than climate, and who are looking to understand the why behind the moves companies and governments are making in this space. With that, here's my conversation with Andreas. Andreas, welcome back to the podcast and for the kickoff of a great series we're doing for the next few weeks covering biodiversity. And you know, for these all-star months, and this isn't really considered that because it's part of our ESG talk series, but one of the questions I've been asking the guests is why the particular topic, like why this topic and why now? So I'm going to kick today off with that question. From your perspective, why is biodiversity such an important topic to talk about now?
I think what I would say is that it's getting traction in a way that it hadn't had until maybe the fall of last year. And because of some interrelationships that we'll talk about with climate, it's following a similar path, but it's following it at, sort of warp speed. Because in many jurisdictions around the world, I think governments and others have come to the conclusion that this is as big a crisis. And some would say, even as we'll hear from some of the other guests, I think, on this series, that it might even be a bigger crisis than what we're facing with climate. And therefore, the fact that all the efforts at the global and even at the company level around climate are a decade or maybe two ahead on biodiversity, that this is an area where everyone needs to catch up very quickly, because given the scale of the problem, you can't wait another 20 years to get to the place where we are on climate today in biodiversity.
Well, and definitely, I think if you start paying attention to either to biodiversity or to nature or any of these topics, the amount of I'll call it press coverage and focus on it is like exponential right now. But one question, maybe just to level set here to begin with, because one of the things we will talk about, I don't know necessarily today, but later in the series is COP15. Yep. And I think it's very confusing for people who maybe until a few years ago weren't even paying attention to like COP26, COP27. They didn't pay attention to those earlier ones. So what is COP15? How does that fit in with the most recent COP27?
So they probably should use a different name, because otherwise people go, are they not going in order? But COP15 is sort of the same thing as the COP27 on climate that was just in Egypt that received a lot of press. COP15 was in Montreal last fall, and it's basically the same thing, except instead of climate, it's for biodiversity. And so it's a forum where governments and other stakeholders get together to talk about the issue. And I think this year was probably the first year that the biodiversity COP. And obviously, it was the 15th one, so it's not the first one, but that really received, I'll call it mainstream media attention. And part of the reason was because they made this big splashy announcement that some people would characterize to be akin to the Paris Accord on climate. So this 30 by 30 sort of announcement that they made, which really involves just commitments by countries to preserve and protect 30% of the land mass and 30% of the oceans effectively.
All right. So I don't often do this on the podcast, but I'm going to chime in here and read something just to show people there is a difference between these two COPs, even though they're both called COP. So the first one, the one that we're all focused on, would be the United Nations Conference of the Parties, and then it's the United Nations Climate Change Conference. And the COP15, more specifically, actually is the United Nations Biodiversity Conference of the Parties to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. So definitely much different when you actually unpack the names. And we will talk a little bit more about 30 by 30 later in the series, but also Andreas may come back to that and ask you a few questions later in this podcast as well. But let's stick with sort of this idea of education here. And I think one of the questions I know I've gotten when I've brought this up, normally for me at least, this has come up in meetings when we were talking about the EU ESG requirements, or CSRD, as our regular listeners would know, because biodiversity is one of the requirements there. So say you're talking to a client and say, okay, one of the things we should focus on here is biodiversity. Probably the reaction you get, at least from some people, is like, what is that? So at least in your view, or if you want to pick up anything from ESRS, E4, or whatever else, what is biodiversity?
I think it's maybe better not to work with a definition, because I don't know that the definitions I've heard of this really help much. So maybe I think about it through sort of two lenses. So I'll call it the impact on the company, which people sometimes call dependencies, which is this idea that every company to some degree uses nature. And the problem is that we tend not to have to pay for it. So it's maybe not quite explicit that we're doing that. But just as an example, so there's many companies that use natural fibers such as cotton in their product, or even indirectly. So if you're a company that supplies uniforms, or a company that supplies linens to a hotel, well, that has cotton. And where does cotton come from? Well, it comes from a farm, and ultimately that has uses soil, and it uses pollinators and all of those other things. So you are using those natural resources, or someone in your supply chain is, in order for you to conduct your business. So that's sort of the one side. And then the other side is sort of the impact that the company has on the environment. So things that you do in your business that make a change to the to the ecosystem. So the simplest example is you construct a building on what was previously land, right? Or you can even
it's still land. It's just now developed land,
or improved land,
yes,
as some people would say. So it's sort of the impact on the company, and then the impact that the company has on nature is broadly the two things that you're trying to capture under this umbrella.
So it's interesting you say that you don't want to work with a definition, because interestingly, and again, regular listeners may remember this, in the summer, the SEC came out with proposed additional ESG disclosure rules for investment advisors and investment companies. So not the climate rule we keep talking about, but this was ESG more broadly. But one notable thing in that rule is that the SEC also said they were not going to define ESG or what an ESG fund was. And there's specific reason there, because it was I'll summarize very, very broadly to say that they were trying to capture anyone who was purporting to be related to ESG. But nonetheless, in a way, it's the same thing, because you're thinking about anything that is, I'll say, like interacting with natural resources in some way is probably falling into this sort of broad category of biodiversity. All right. So then, Andreas, I know you gave the cotton example, but any other examples you can share? Because I do think illustrating these examples helps as people are kind of thinking this through.
Yeah, let me start with one that I think illustrates not only the concept, but maybe some of the knock-on issues that we will explore over the series. So, imagine you had two identical beverage companies, and the only difference between them was one was really efficient at using water, and the other one was grossly inefficient at using water. That's a natural resource, right? Clean, fresh water is something that in many parts of the world increasingly becoming scarce. If you look at their financial statements, because in most parts of the world, water is not particularly expensive, or maybe doesn't carry a market price that really reflects that growing scarcity, you may not even be able to tell that those two companies apart, because it's almost like a rounding error, the fact that one is using much more water than the other one, or maybe the one that's using more water has a slightly less generous stock comp plan, so it all kind of gets netted out in the P&L. So the financial statements are not telling you that the one company has this excess dependency on nature because they're using so much water. But it's also not telling you how difficult would it be for that company to solve that problem, i.e. to have less of a draw on natural capital, because the true cost of what they're doing is not making its way into the P&L. And then, as you know, like once it's not in the P&L, it probably doesn't get managed. And that's what this new world is about, to say, hey, we need to identify this, and risk is even not the right word. That's why dependencies is probably a better word. That we need to identify this because it's not in the financial statements, unless some regulator is going to come along and say we're going to, increase the price of water tenfold.
Yeah. So before you go on, Andreas, let me jump in here on two things. So first of all, you reference netted out in the P&L, and just for the literal people in our audience, Andreas was definitely not talking about netting into the same financial statement line item. And again,
operating expenses would be maybe the same despite the difference in
exactly.
water usage.
So again, just don't want to mislead anyone here. And then I think, Andreas, then the other thing would be, you raised, I think, a very interesting point, and whether you say dependencies, risks, or otherwise, is I think in some ways, we're going to talk about climate later, but this really does correlate to climate from the point of view is I think there's growing recognition with climate that emissions have a cost, and you might not be paying market price for them now, although, we're starting to see schemes like the one in the EU where we're going to see more of that. And so at some point, if water is charged in a way that's reflective of its value, then those two beverage companies, all of a sudden it's not a rounding error. So again, we're going to get more into that, but I think it's an important point to raise here is that this really does fundamentally, ultimately result in potentially a bottom line dollar impact, not just they're using more than their fair share of resources or otherwise. All right. So then, Andreas, any other examples that you'd like to cover?
Maybe another one is just the suburban office park, right, where maybe it was built 10 years ago and what was there previously was wetlands, and maybe they did, I'll call it, quote unquote, the right thing, and they retained a little bit of the wetlands that's sort of on the periphery of the property. And so now you go in there and you lease that office space and you say, well, I don't have an impact because I'm not the one who decided to drain the wetlands and build the buildings, so that's somebody else's problem. But even then, if you're in the northern part of the country like we are, that there's still decisions that get made while you're occupying that building. So for example, how aggressively do you salt the parking lot during the winter months to prevent ice forming where people might slip and fall? But on the other hand, the next time it rains, all of that salt ends up in that remaining wetlands, and what was once a freshwater system is now a borderline saltwater system. So you still have this impact, even with something as common and generic as as an office building. And even if you're not the one who did the initial damage to the ecosystem, this idea that damage can continue even after the initial damage, right? So that it's not like it's done and then you can't worry about it anymore because you weren't the one who did it, right?
But I guess, Andreas, to that point, so there's lots of parties involved here, right? Because there's the initial developer, there was the actual company that built the office building, there's probably someone who's operating the office building, original tenant, new tenant, potential future tenant. Like there's all these different people. And I do think it's very easy to say, well, obviously that's not my issue, because maybe if I'm the tenant, I'm not the one deciding if you should put salt on the pavement in the winter. And so what am I supposed to do?
Well, I think this is going to be one of these questions about attribution, right? So first you have the initial damage. Who do I allocate that to? The builder, the property owner, the person who commissioned the project, But I was using the salt example just because, well, the tenant probably has some influence on that, where they could say to the landlord, hey, we're trying to be biodiversity, whatever you want to call it, good.
Friendly. Nature
yeah.
positive, we'll talk about later.
We'd like you to be judicious in how you apply the salt. And we don't want to go out in the parking lot and find that when the truck that dispenses it goes over a bump, half of it falls out and there's a pile that's 2 feet tall that, again, eventually will end up in the water unless that contractor is instructed that, hey, when that happens, get a shovel and put it back in the truck, right? So this attribution question will be a difficult question, but I think the point here is that there's many parties that can influence whether things get better or worse, and you should not be too quick to just say this doesn't apply to me. And the standards that you referred earlier, like the ESRS 4 on biodiversity, has lots of things in there that gets at these, I'll call them second and third tier effects. So it is very difficult to conclude, I'm not a pesticide company or I'm not a mining company, so this whole biodiversity thing doesn't apply to me.
So, Andreas, I think that's a really key point and one we should sort of poke at a little bit more, because I do think for many companies, maybe they're perhaps more focused on their emissions. So I'm a large utility. I have a lot of emissions. I'm a large distribution company. Emissions are my main impact. And, I'm not agriculture. I'm not one of the aquaculture, someone who's directly sort of, I'll call it, interacting with the earth in that way. I'm not a beverage company that's using water. And so if I am one of these companies and I have so many corporate priorities, we've spent a lot of podcasts talking about uncertainty in the current environment, what's going on from macroeconomic and geopolitical perspective. How can I then as a corporation say, well, biodiversity is something I need to raise in my sort of profile? Or again, we're going to use the term later, nature positive. How do you prioritize that as an organization?
I think there's a couple things, right? One is most companies have not done an assessment currently, and I think these new reporting standards are going to effectively motivate people to do that, to really understand how dependent are they. Because again, it may not be in your company, but it may be in your supply chain. Then there's certainly regulation in some parts of the world coming around this that you need to sort of size up what your exposure is, both from a dependency perspective, but also the impact you're having. This is getting more and more into the popular sort of mindset. So you'll start to see pressures from employees and customers, just like we're seeing in climate. Again, having your arms around this is going to be important. But I think maybe the other thing that I've learned as I've gotten smarter on this topic is just, if you just take something as basic as chemicals, all companies use them, and all chemicals eventually end up back in the ecosystem.
Wait. I have to cut in here. So we are a large professional services firm. How are we using chemicals?
So we have people that come in here and clean the offices, and they use fairly toxic things to clean the office. I'm just looking at the whiteboard now where there's a bottle of something to clean the whiteboard that I'm sure has lots of fairly nasty things in it. And then you're going to use that, rub it off with a paper towel or something. It goes in the trash and eventually, ends up in the ecosystem.
Right. But not to be too devil's advocate here, but how is that one paper towel really impacting things?
Well, how many paper towels do you think get thrown away across all of our offices? And we're just one company, right? I think the other piece, is we'll hear on some of the other episodes, is that when you take all these collective actions together, where you say, it's like the one drop in an ocean, but when everybody's putting many drops into the ocean, that the cumulative effect is pretty substantial. And because the measurement isn't happening today, people don't have the appreciation that their little contribution, that it all adds up.
So that your point is that you don't have to be the one who's actually involved in agriculture and putting all of the fertilizer and everything else into the ground. Even these other smaller actions, if you kind of add them all up, or think about sourcing parts and paper and all these different things, that cumulatively, even for those types of companies, there is an impact.
That's right. And then the other piece, as we'll hear about in some of these other episodes, is that if one of these ecosystems collapses, even if I'm not directly dependent on it, it's going to have knock-on effects through the entire value chain of the economy, right? So, we're a consulting firm, right? Even if whatever ecosystem goes sideways because it goes over some tipping point doesn't affect us directly. It will affect one of our suppliers, one of our customers. Maybe it'll affect where some of our employees live, or there'll be this second tier effect that will come back because kind of the entire economy is built on the ecosystem sort of working the way they have for the last 2,000 years when we built civilization. And if one of them stops functioning the way we're used to, the entire economy is going to have to adapt. And we don't know what that adaptation will cost, what it will unleash in terms of winners and losers, which is what happens anytime you have a, whatever you want to call it, a structural change.
Well, let me then ask another devil's advocate question. So you've talked here about regulation. You and I both mentioned CSRD and, the specific biodiversity disclosure requirements. And again, if I'm sitting here thinking, well, I'm a U.S. company and hopefully they've been listening enough to know they better be paying attention and seeing how CSRD will impact them. But let's presume that at this point, again, that's not higher on their radar screen. Then again, well, okay, I get it's an issue. Maybe they're convinced from what we just said, but it's not something that I'm reporting now. What's going to lead me to start reporting this information?
So we talked about the 30 by 30 from COP15. So similar to how the Paris Accord was sort of a country level agreement, countries will then go away and say, okay, I need to action that in my country, and they will then write rules, regulations. And again, maybe not every country will be as aggressive in terms of how they implement that. And some places like the US have a lot of land that's already national parks and probably are a bigger step towards that 30 by 30 than some densely populated European countries where they have really small parks. But there will be, certainly for multinationals that operate in other parts of the world, there will be new rules and regulations around land use, because I think, as we'll hear, the single biggest contributor to sort of biodiversity loss is the use of land. And so that's where a lot of the focus will be. And so there will be new rules and regulations around the world around what you can do with land, and that if you do things that degrade it, that there will be, whether it's consequences directly in terms of fines or things like that, or that you have an obligation to go remediate some other already degraded property elsewhere to negate what you're doing now.
So it's interesting, Andreas, you referenced 30 by 30. So it's like, oh, I wonder for the US what this really means. And I think showing the complexity of this issue is just based on my quick internet search here. You can first get something that says like up to 47, just under 47% of the total area of the US is undeveloped. But then if you say how much is, quote, untouched, which is different, that's only 3%. And then there's all these other definitions of what has people living on it, what's the land being used for, and otherwise. And so I think if you really start to dig into this, then by the time you have cropland, land for grazing cattle, which by the way is 25%, which is much more than I would have expected, 30% cropland, only 5% occupied by people. And by the way, these are also all unaudited statistics that as an auditor I should be cringing by using. But I think it does sort of start to demonstrate that this issue is complex, and unlike with climate change, not to say climate change is not complex, but at least the metrics that we're working off of, we can both look at the same list of 7 gases. Now, do we agree it's the right gases? Maybe there's, some discussion on that, but we're not trying to say, well, what does it matter if it's cropland or cattle land or untouched or undeveloped, and all these different definitions. And it feels like we have so far to go in that conversation.
No, that's exactly right. And that's, I think, why we're trying to put it on people's radar screens, that it's nearly not as well developed as the climate space in terms of what are the impacts and how does one go about figuring out their inventory of dependencies and impacts. Yes.
So maybe I'll have to do a little more research on those statistics before we release this, but definitely, at least directionally, it's interesting. So we're since we're on that point, then let's talk about biodiversity versus climate. I think we've hit a lot of this. And again, it is a theme in the rest of the series, but I think it's a helpful, at least starting point for people, although recognizing some of our podcast listeners, if not many are still even skeptics on what their particular company or the impact of that. But nonetheless, if you look at the two issues side by side, what are the things that you think about?
So there's clearly some places where there's an interrelationship. So the simple example is if you cut down a forest, that's releases carbon, and so bad for climate change, but you're also in the process presumably destroying an ecosystem. So you're kind of ticks both, right? But then you could do something like water pollution, right, which might damage a coral reef or whatever it is, but presumably doesn't really do much of anything from a climate perspective. So there's areas of overlap. There's clearly areas of difference. I'd also think about if you're a company that has a very significant carbon footprint, you probably have a meaningful biodiversity footprint as well. Not 100%, but there probably is some real correlation there. And then probably the biggest thing is, just like we spend a lot of time in the climate area focused on maybe the biggest impacts are not what happens within your four walls, it's what happens somewhere in your value chain, so the scope 3. While we don't currently explicitly have a rule like the GHG protocol for biodiversity that has scope 1, 2, 3, but I think it's a kind of a useful way to think about it, that for a lot of companies, that impact that really matters, or the dependency that really matters, is somewhere in the value chain. So back to I'm not actually a cotton farmer, right? But cotton is a key part of my product, or I use it extensively in my service. So, I'm not the company that makes the linens. I'm the company that launders the linens, right? So no more cotton. I have to do something else, or maybe if they're synthetic linens all of a sudden, then maybe they don't need to be laundered as often, or it's a totally different process, so I need different equipment. And these are the kind of things when we start to talk about dependencies and impacts, you start to very quickly see how it like rattles through the economy, and it impacts people who are far removed from the decision of where am I planting the cotton, what kind of pesticides am I using. The guy who launders linens is not thinking about those things today, right?
Probably not the user of the linens either, although I did have a bit of a visceral reaction to unlaundered synthetic linens. So in any event.
It wasn't an endorsement.
All right. Any other points there? Because otherwise I have a follow-up in terms of whether or not, we have this net zero, which I think people were able to get their heads around of what net zero means, how you get there, lots of argument, but at least conceptually. Do we have any similar concepts? It seems way more complicated for biodiversity.
Yeah, I think the big thing with biodiversity that's different than climate is most people who've studied this issue think that net zero is not good enough, that just kind of not doing any more damage going forward, that the level of damage that's already been done is substantial enough that you'd need to do better than net zero. You have to do something, people call it nature positive, where you need to start to unravel some of the historical impacts. And I think one of the most significant insights that comes out of that thinking is, I think if you read kind of the newspaper and the like around this issue, people focus on, we need to make sure that we don't cut down the Amazon or something like that. And it's almost like it's a problem that happens somewhere far away that we need to prevent that damage going forward. It's actually, to really deal with the problem, developed countries who degraded their ecosystems to some extent, a century or more ago, there's actually need to remediate some of that as well. So this isn't just a developing country, please don't do the things that we did 100 or 200 years ago. And then who pays for that, and all the debates that you hear sometimes in the popular press. There's actually a need to do some things even in the developed world, and so again, that's not the way most people have historically framed the issue, and that is something certainly I've learned as I've gotten smarter on this issue.
So, Andreas, that's definitely something that's very complex, and that we will speak more about later in the podcast series. So, I don't want to give too many highlights, but I also do want people to kind of know what they should be looking out for. And I would say for myself, as to your point, I've gotten more educated and had the opportunity to talk to these other guests that we're going to talk to, that the fact also that this is actually an opportunity. So it's not just a risk. It's not just a dependency. It's not just something that's going to cost money, but instead there actually is like a true opportunity for someone who focuses on this and gets ahead. And maybe in your beverage company, for example, or your beverage company example, for example, maybe that heavy water user actually can jet ahead of the other one by focusing on this now and really finding a way to be even more efficient, although inherently beverages use water, but maybe there's something else positive that they can be doing. So just curious for you if there's one or two other themes that you would just pull out. So it's like sort of a preview, sort of tease for our upcoming episodes.
So one of the things, and again, is sort of a difference relative to climate change, is that climate is sort of a global problem because there's one atmosphere. Kind of doesn't matter where the emissions take place; they all go to the same place ultimately. Biodiversity is much more local because ecosystems are local and they're not the same all around the world. But the implication of that from an opportunity perspective is that unlike climate, where everybody basically needs to do the same thing, which is reduce their emissions of these 7 gases. And it doesn't matter where they do it around the world. It's just a matter of, do they do it? Here, every company is going to have a fundamentally unique biodiversity footprint per se, because not everybody's located in the exact same place. Not everybody sources things from the exact same place. And so as soon as you have this differentiation between companies, that they have a different risk profile and a different exposure profile, means that they can take fundamentally different strategies and approaches to this issue, which presents the opportunity not just to be the first mover, like in the beverage example, but that you can just take a fundamentally different approach that might be very appealing to customers, to other stakeholders whose interests you're trying to manage. So I think if you get your arms around what your dependencies and exposures are, figuring out which of those you can address and how, and doing that potentially in a different way than your competitors, may be brand enhancing, and again, may help you with attracting the best workforce, particularly the younger workforce that is more tuned into this issue than others are. So I think that differentiation possibility is much greater here than it is with, say, something like climate.
All right. Well, Andreas, as always, such a pleasure to talk to you today, and definitely looking forward to hearing what we're going to learn in these upcoming episodes. So to our listeners, definitely encourage you to tune in because there's a lot more to this conversation. So thanks, Andreas. That's our show for today. Tune in next week for more fresh episodes. So that you never miss any of our audio content, follow the PwC Accounting Podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. And to stay up to date on all our latest accounting and reporting news, sign up for our newsletter at viewpoint.pwc.com. From Thought Leadership at PwC, I'm Heather Horn. Thanks for tuning in.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates, and they sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.